Hey there, my name is Brad Jenkins. I am the general manager and an advisor at The Breeze at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I'm glad you're joining me for my virtual session on how you can work well with writers, how you can coach writers. If you've been an editor for a while or have just started as being an editor, you may have had this experience where a writer turns in a story that you think is going to be one way, but it actually turns out to be something completely different. So I want to be able to help you to figure out how you can work with writers in a better way so that you get the story that you're hoping to get from the beginning at the end of the process. And that requires a relationship between the writer and the editor in which you're collaborating. So often editors think of themselves as the person who comes up at the end and sweeps up the messes, cleans up the commas, cleans up the punctuation, but really an editor has to be a partner throughout the process. And so I want to give you a process that will help you in that so that you can work well with the writers that you have. And if you're a writer, this hopefully will help you to be able to work with your editors in a better way so that you can be collaborative and so that you can write and produce better stories. So I'm going to share my screen now and we're going to get into this presentation. So this is called The Right Stuff. It's basically a crash course in journalistic reporting and writing, but it's more or less a process that you can follow uh, as writers and editors to produce better stories. What I hope to do during this session is first to develop a process for reporting and writing, to help you to have a process that works well. Second, I hope that I can teach you a little bit about concise writing and revising. That's a really key part in our process. You know, with people who are reading stories these days, they are their attention span is less, and they have lots of other things. So we need to be concise, and we need to revise in a way that helps our readers understand the stories. And then I'm going to give you some ideas for practice. If we were doing this session in person, we'd get to practice in person, but I'll give you some ideas for practice. So this is a great quote from The Elements of Style. If you've never read The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, I highly suggest that you pick it up. It's a small book. It's actually, I was going to pull it out here, but I can't find it. Here it is. It's on my bookshelf. It's a really small book. It's thin. It's a fairly quick read, especially the end. But the end of this book is called An Approach to Style. And it's a really good section if you want to be a writer to read about. But one of the things that Strunk and White say is that writing, to be effective, must follow closely the thoughts of the writer, but not necessarily in order those thoughts occur. Um, and so you can read this on your screen, but the big thing I want you to take away is the first principle of composition is to foresee or determine the shape of what is to come and pursue that shape. And so planning is a key to telling an effective story. Planning throughout the process, how you're going to report, how you're going to write, what you're going to do. You can't just jump into the process. And a good editor is someone who helps the writer to plan. A good editor is someone who comes alongside the writer and helps them to plan. So these are the steps that I'm going to take you through. First, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you come up with ideas. Then we're going to talk about how do you brief the story? How do you plan for reporting? A lot of people go straight from idea to reporting, but there's a key step here that you want to plan that. You want to plan how you're going to report. Then we're going to talk about debriefing, um, which is taking the reporting and figuring out what you've learned. Of course, you're going to have a reporting stage and a writing stage and a revising stage. So we're going to go through these different processes. I'm going to break them down and help you to understand what they are. So first, ideas. Uh, I would I would say, you know, you think about where do you find your ideas? Here are some possible places that you as writers and editors can find ideas. You see the word beats, that means an area of coverage. It might be that you have a reporter who's covering the student government, or that you have a reporter who's covering arts and entertainment, or maybe you have someone who's covering different parts of your school. It could be that they're covering clubs or organizations. But a good beat system helps reporters because it helps them to have a place to focus. It's like those people who cover sports when they cover a football or they cover basketball. They are the person who knows that area better than anybody else. So I'd suggest that if you have different areas of your school, arts, sports, organizations, clubs, academics, student government, all those different things, you could break out your staff into beats so that they could cover those different areas. Another thing that's really important is curiosity. I mean, curiosity probably should be listed number one on this list because curiosity is the foundation point for finding ideas. You should be developing curiosity. You should be asking lots of questions as you walk around your community, as you walk around your neighborhood, as you walk around your school. You should be like a 2-year-old asking why, how. You should be really curious about the things that are happening around you. Um, you should be finding story ideas everywhere you go because you're a curious person. You should be using this phrase, I wonder what, or I wonder how, or I wonder why. I love those two words, I wonder, because they get at stories are all about wonder. They're all about finding answers to our questions. So be developing your curiosity. The other thing I'd say is that you could be eavesdropping. And I don't necessarily mean in a rude kind of way. But what I mean is pay attention to what's happening around you. As you're walking around your school, as you're having conversations, what are people talking about? What are they worried about? What's on their mind? Those are potential story ideas. I'd also suggest that you be looking at other news sources. What's happening in the world and in the state and in the nation that you could localize. As you think about uh, different trends, for instance, I've listed there. Are things increasing or decreasing? Are things changing in some way? What are some new fads, trends, things that you could look into and see how that's happening in your own with your own audience? And then I'd say, are you finding ideas? If you're not, then I say go back to the curiosity stage. Really develop that questioning, asking people around you what's happening, what's interesting. And it's not all about events, it's about asking people what they're thinking about, what issues are happening, and things like that. After you've come up with an idea, you have to brief that idea. And what do I mean by briefing? What I mean is you need to narrow down the idea. It's one thing to say, I'm going to write a story about graduation. Well, there are lots of things you could write about graduation. You could write about the speaker. You could write about the different ways that people decorated their hats. You could write about seniors and different plans that they have after graduation. You could write about challenges students face to get to graduation. There's so many different places you could go with that one big idea. So what you want to do is you want to take your idea from kind of a topic idea, like I want to write about SATs, or I want to write about how students are learning from home this semester. You've got these broad ideas, but you need to narrow them down. And the briefing stage helps you narrow it down. It asks you, what exactly is this story about? What am I going to write about? It also asks, who am I going to talk to? It asks, who do I need to talk to as far as like, who are my sources going to be? What questions do I need to ask them? And what information do I need to gather before I start writing? So the briefing stage is really important. It's really important for the editor and the writer to come together and to talk about the story and how you're going to do it. Basically, these are some questions that you could ask as you're doing this briefing stage. What's the angle of the story? Who are my sources? What do I need to know? What's the big question that I'm trying to answer? How can I tell the story? Am I going to, for instance, am I going to tell this story as a long form feature story? Is it going to be a short, bright 300-word piece? Maybe it's going to be a graphic. Maybe it's going to be a video. Maybe it's going to be a photo slideshow. How do I tell this story? And it should always go to, how do I tell this story in the best way possible? And then finally, you want to talk about, how can we illustrate the story? Will I have a video, a photo to go with it, graphics? So the briefing stage is all about planning the report. And once you've got your planning down, then you can go ahead and you can report. Now, usually if we were in person, I'd have you give this a try. But if you're watching this with someone else, or if you are even with your siblings or a friend, you could give this a try. So you could think about, what's a story that I'm about to write. Sit down and think about it. And if you can't do it with someone, you could even write down those questions. You go back to the questions we ask and you answer those questions. So I want you to give that a try. So maybe you could pause the video, give it a little bit of a try, and then we'll come back together and talk about the next step. Okay, so now that you've planned to report, you're ready to report. You're ready to go out and do the majority of the work that it takes. I want to just emphasize that reporting consists of interviews, but also observation. So interviews are really important. They're for gathering the information that you need. You should be talking to various sources, people of differing backgrounds and that have differing information. But you also need to be thinking about using your 5 senses, especially when you're covering things that you want to describe. You should make sure that your reporting is not just about you asking questions, but you also gathering information by observing and by seeing what's happening. So if you were covering a graduation, or if you were covering a school event or a play or something like that, you would want to use your 5 senses to think about, what do I see and hear and touch and taste and feel in this situation? And how can I bring that into the reporting? So I'm often taking notes about things that I see or hear. If you're covering, say, a gathering or a meeting even, you could, if there's tension in the room, you could note that. This doesn't always come into play because some of our stories are just straightforward, but you do want to think about, what am I seeing as I'm reporting? So it is the interviews. They are important. They're important for getting the information, but the observation is important for getting the feel of the situation. And use your curiosity here. Sit down before you're reporting and come down with as many questions as you can. But never feel like your list of questions, you have this list of questions and you say, oh, I have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No. Use those questions as your guide and jump off as your sources give you other information that's important or interesting. Feel free to jump off of those things and go into other areas. After you've done all your reporting, you want to sit down with your editor and debrief. If you're an editor, you want to have your reporters sit down and debrief the reporting process. What does this mean? Well, this is a backstop for writers. Instead of going from reporting straight to writing, we give them a stopping point where they're able to think about what they've reported and where they're going to go with the story. So a lot of reporters will just take their notes and sit down and start typing away, right? And you've probably done that before. There are some hazards with this, because sometimes you'll end up, you write your story and then you get stuck, or you write your story and then you can't come up with an ending because you've used all your information and you haven't thought through the structure. A good debriefing session helps a writer to come up with the shape of the story. It's saying to the writer, what information are you going to tell the reader and how are you going to do it? It's giving a shape to the writing. It's planning to write. So Strunk and White also say that planning must be a deliberate prelude to writing. The first principle of composition, therefore, is to foresee or determine the shape of what is to come and pursue that shape. So your story is going to have a shape. It's going to have a beginning, a middle, and end, or it's going to start one place, go to another place, and then come back to the beginning. Whatever that shape is, that's what you're trying to determine during the debriefing stage. And that's where a good editor listens. In a debriefing stage, an editor listens. They listen to the reporter talk about where they're taking the story. And as needed, the editor then can jump in and say, well, what about this? Or what about that? So a good editor during the debriefing stage will listen and will ask good questions to help the writer to be able to come up with the shape of the story. And these are some of the questions that you could be asking. These are the things you should be dealing with in a debriefing session. What's the shape of your story? We just talked about that. Here's another thing. You could say, tell me the story in one sentence, or tell me the story as you tell your mom. This is getting to a place where you can tell the story without jargon, without all of the different ways that we journalists tend to try to tell stories in a very formal way. It's kind of breaking it down and saying, here's what the story is. So it's instead of if you went to a city council meeting and they talked about raising taxes and it was all of this complicated information, in one sentence it might be, taxpayers are going to pay an extra $2,000 next year in taxes. That is a very straightforward way of putting something that could be very complicated. So you're finding that one sentence, that uncomplicated way to tell it. And then what are the parts? That's a good question to ask as well. How will you tell the story? What are the parts? I'm going to lead with this, and then I'm going to go into this topic, and then I'm going to go into this topic, and then I'm going to go into this topic. It's giving the editor your plan for writing. And this is all to the benefit of the writer, because the writer then sits down with a plan and is ready to go. You can look these up online. Here are some possible story shapes. I would normally in person have some handouts for you that I could give you that would show some of these, but I suggest you do some research on some of these. The inverted pyramid is the most popular form of news writing, where you've got the most important thing to the least important information. The kebab is where you chunk the story into various themes. So you might have a lead, and then you'll have part one is about one thing, part two is about another aspect of the story, part three, and then you end it. The martini glass is where you start with an inverted pyramid and then you tell the story in chronological order. The Wall Street Journal format is a fairly famous format that you start with an anecdote, and then you have a paragraph that tells what that anecdote has to do with the whole story. So basically, you tell a story about someone, then you would say that this person represents a larger trend, for instance, and then you would go into the rest of the story about that trend. And so I would say if you want to look into possible story shapes, that could be a whole lesson on itself, but I wanted to mention those very briefly. So again, if we were in person, I would have you try this, but I'd like you to pause the video and try this on your own. Maybe you have a story that you're working on, and I'd like you to think about how would you shape that story. Take some time, either jot it out, outline it on a piece of paper, or if you're with someone, you could sit and have a conversation about that. So after you've done all this, after you have gotten ready to write, then you can sit down and write. After you've done the debriefing and you've done your planning, you can go ahead and begin to write. Here are some tips that I would give you as far as the writing phase. First, use the plan you came up with. That's the whole point of making the plan. It's to help you to be able to get the story down as quickly as possible. You have a plan in front of you, follow the plan. Another tip is to write while you report. You may have some moments where you're doing reporting that you want to actually write some of your paragraphs while you're reporting. Go ahead and do that. You may end up in your plan, but it helps, especially with longer feature stories, for you if you've seen something that you want to describe later, to go ahead and write that down. I've read of reporters who are working on long stories who go back, they go back to their office after they've done a long interview and they actually write a lot of stuff. It all won't end up in the story, but it's a good way of getting the stuff from your head onto the paper. Another thing is that there's this concept of vomit drafts, which sounds really disgusting, or down drafts to get it down, or crappy first drafts I list. Don't be afraid of the first draft. Take your plan and just write. Get it out of your head. Silence your internal critic and get it onto the paper. Don't worry about revising right away. Just get it all on the paper. We'll come back through with revising and cut out all the crappy stuff. But for now, is just you need to get that stuff on the paper. Anne Lamott says this about first draft. She says perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor, the enemy of the people. It'll keep you cramped and insane your whole life, and it is the main obstacle between you and a crappy first draft. Perfectionism is a mean, frozen form of idealism, while messes are the artist's true friend. What people somehow, inadvertently I'm sure, forgot to mention when we were children was that we need to make messes in order to find out who we are and why we are here, and by extension, what we're supposed to be writing. She's saying it's okay if your first draft is crappy. So that's when you come through and you revise. You come through and you work on spelling and AP style. You cut the sentences that are wonderful but that don't need to be there. You let it sit for a while, perhaps. Write your draft, put it aside, and then come back to it. Maybe have a fellow editor or reader read it and say, do you understand what I'm trying to say? Another way that you can edit is to read it out loud, or some people read it backwards because you find places where you could cut or things that you've messed up. Ask yourself as you're reading it, is this really what I mean? A lot of times we as journalists, again, we get into journalistese and we write things that don't make sense to the general audience. So is this what I really mean? And the other thing I'd say is, and this is from Strunk and White as well, vigorous writing is concise. Vigorous writing is concise. And what Strunk and White mean about this is that you take out the unnecessary things. You get rid of words, extra words that you don't need. You get rid of sentences that you don't need. There are tons of places that you can cut. One of the things that they say in here is that every paragraph will not have unnecessary sentences, and sentences won't have unnecessary words. So you go through and you find those places where you can cut down to make it very crisp. And there you see, vigorous writing is concise. This is the quote I was saying there. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph, no unnecessary sentences. For the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines, and a machine no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all sentences short or avoid all detail and treat subjects only in outline, but that every word tell. So every word counts. Here are some examples of places that we tend to be wordy. In a hasty manner. It's just hastily. Or the reason why is that, well, you could say that with one word, because. So find those areas like you see on the screen and cut them down in your stories. Here are some further resources for you. Poynter.org is an excellent think tank for journalists. I would suggest that you go there and read their stuff. They have numerous authors, writers, bloggers who are writing about our craft. And one of the things they want to do is help journalists improve. So I encourage you to go to there to find out more. The other thing that I would suggest again is The Elements of Style, which I quoted in here. And I would suggest that you read that as well. And I suggest too that you just be patient with yourself as you learn these things. Writing and telling stories is much like learning an instrument. The more we do it, the more we practice, the better we become. So continue to practice, continue to work on your craft. And I wish you all the best. And thank you for joining me on this. I've left my email there. If you have any questions that you've come up, I'd be glad to answer them, make it interactive. I know this is kind of a strange way of doing a workshop, but if you want to email me, you can reach out to me by email. For those of you who are looking for, universities that you might want to check out, I love JMU, obviously, because I work here, and I love the student media groups that we have here. And so I'd encourage you, if you have any questions about that as well, to reach out, and I'd be glad to help.